why we have policies, right? So that's the short introduction. We have a government, we have the citizens, we have business world, we have the financial world, and there's a cycle, a hidden promise between each other, right? They promise security, workforce, between the different elements, right? So, Sisan, you're in the element where you are part of the business, right? You are the element, you're a service provider, so you are a business, but you're also creating the link between these. You are sitting right in the middle. You are trying to create the policies and link the world together, right? Yes. So let me ask you, Ala, can you explain in simple terms what is policies and what are regulations?
Yeah, thank you, Henrik. I'm very honored here to represent the Digital Cooperation Organization in this panel alongside with my esteemed colleague. So in simple words, when we are going to say policy are things that you want and plan as an organization to do and aim to do. Regulations are how are you going to implement them. So one will provide the general topic, the other one will provide how it's going to be implemented as a regulation. And usually people comply to regulations, and it provides more context on how it's going to be implemented. So this is in very plain, simple words.
Yes. You're also a mother, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Could you explain in a simple example, like a mother,
yeah,
what is the difference between a policy and a regulation?
So yes, when you say that, for example, my kid's using the internet, and now with this openness and having that accessibility to electronics and internet, so having a general policy where you say, okay, you have to use it in a very balanced way, but then to have a regulation that they have to comply is 2 hours a day. You have to comply to that. This is how a regulation is set.
Yes, that's a very good example, right? A policy is a directional view, right? It's an area on how much you can use the television. A regulation is that somebody needs to implement it towards the children to say 2 hours, that's 2 hours, or the television needs to turn off. Sisan, you are a receiver of a policy, right?
Yes.
So how does that shape Uber's, what is your experience with Uber's relationship in the different regions around the regulations and policies?
Yeah, thank you so much, Henrik. We've had an interesting journey, and I think if I think back to when we first started doing policy work at Uber, one of our biggest tasks was really working with governments and agencies in order to help them be educated about the role of technology, and specifically the role of technology in mobility. And so a lot of the process has really been about helping them to figure out how they need to modernize transport regulations, or even develop brand new regulations in order to be able to account for companies with business models like ours. I think we've of course started with transport at the base of it, but since then we've evolved into so many other different topics like labor, like data, like tax, and so it's a continuously evolving field.
So regulations can be a blessing and a curse for you.
100%.
Yes. So how do you see the future in terms of how regulations will enable Uber to grow or to be inhibited to grow?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the big things that we look for when we work with governments, because it's such a new field, because technology is something that's quickly evolving, and it's something that people are struggling to understand and also have a lot of foresight on, what we have to be really careful with on the regulatory environment is to make sure that it's not too rigid, that we have a fair market as much as possible in order for technology and companies to be able to evolve, to be able to adapt, to be able to be flexible. And so especially coming from the government side, in order to enable these kinds of flexible, slightly more open policies and not be too rigid by copying and pasting something from somewhere else, there's certainly got to be that openness towards being educated, towards collaborating with the private sector, towards really also building that capacity within government so that the thinking is there, that also that policy making is driven by data, driven by facts, driven by information, and not just how someone feels or what they personally, what their personal opinions are.
Yeah. So, Ivana, you are within an organization that develops solutions to adapt the regulations, right? So how are you focusing on this to enable organizations to adapt policies and gain an advantage of that?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Does it work? Yes, great. So it's a really interesting question, and I think it's great to be on this panel also because, I mean, there are 3 female thought leaders is a really good thing. So I just wanted to say, I think we've gone through lots of different phases, haven't we, around the world? So we've gone through a sort of phase of self-regulation where,
Yep.
you know, in the internet, in the web spaces, we've left companies self-regulate. And I think now, you know, we've seen that that's not enough. And I think all companies agree that that's not enough. And in the last few years, we've seen some amazing things, but we've also seen some of the harms that come from that. I talk as a privacy person. Then we've gone on to sort of the more sort of government-led regulation. We've seen the general data protection regulation in Europe, and now we've seen 120 legislation around the world, for example, governing privacy. And now I think, you know, in looking at sort of co-regulation, where you have the responsibility of business alongside the responsibility of government. Now, within all this, you know, Wipro is a leader in the space of solutions to all of this. And now that's interesting because the challenges that organizations have at the moment is how you really future-proof the innovation that you put out. Because the issue is, let's take, for example, artificial intelligence or automated decision-making, thinking, for example, how that is important to Uber in your work. Then the issue is that regulation is changing and quite rapidly. We don't know yet how much the law is going to govern a lot of these things. We have, for example, on algorithmic decision making, you have data protection authorities all around the world saying, oh, you know, this is about transparency, this is about explainability. Then you have specific legislation about artificial intelligence. So I think a lot of companies, they have some really fantastic stuff, but they say, well, there is an issue here. How do I actually future-proof what I'm doing so that I can actually deal with, you know, really rapid changing policy, rapid changing regulation around the world, and also with a lot of convergence around the world? You know, we have a lot of convergence, but there is also a lot of divergence. If I look at the privacy side, I mean, we agree on the big themes, but there is also a lot of divergence and a lot of differences around the world. So I think the key point that I'm trying to make here is that that it's really important to code a lot of these regulations into the design of what we do. To me, that is a priority number 1, because, you know, the more that you're able to embed all the regulatory elements, privacy legislation, for example, using and leveraging privacy engineering, privacy technology to make sure that these things actually happen by default. Otherwise, companies would be overwhelmed and trying to then come in and say, oh, we have to amend this or amend that. And to me, the key point is that I always, I mean, I sound like a bit of a, I always say this, but we've got to break, you know, this silo culture that we have between the legal teams doing the law and the regulation, the technical team doing all the technical changes. We speak different languages, and that's not right. We've got to speak the same language. So I think the way that, you know, we do it, I do it within my organization, is to really to create the spaces where we can learn the same language, so that if I talk about algorithmic decision making, lawyers can understand me, technical teams can understand me, and we can achieve together the solution. To me, that is the way forward on this.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. So, and this is the heart of what we are as an organization here, to create that ecosystem where we bring on the table the government, the public sector, the private sector, all of them together on the same table from different countries, to really create the correct set of policies that will enable us to have that more growth in economy, in digital economy, in emerging technologies. Because at the end, the efficient way in implementing any policy is to have that hand in hand with the consumer, with the public sector, with the private sector, all of us on the same table. Because at the end, if you have a policy that it is not implementable. So what is we saw all the cost of having that, and the cost of not having that alignment between government and non-government, having each one of them working alone, having the development being done on one side and then the implementation on the other side. So you saw, as you said, issues in data privacy, digital taxations, and much more coming. We are talking about a really evolving area. Things are accelerating in the digital economy and in the technology very quickly. And in the future coming now, we have to realize that 70% in the next decade of the total GDP will be from digital economy and emerging technology and that growth. So if we cannot have the correct set of policies, if we do not create that ecosystem where everyone, the correct people, as you said, from legal, from technical, from government, from policymakers, all of them hearing each other and understanding what is needed, we will be behind.
That is an amazing point, because you also highlight